right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third and final webinar in the Timber and Tide series. Tonight's webinar is titled Managing Forests for Bird Conservation. My name is Heather Goebel, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Seven Capes Bird Alliance. We're super thrilled to again have so many wonderful sponsors for tonight's program, and I want to shout out a special thanks to the Oregon chapters of the Sierra Club, the Wild Salmon Center, Mid-Willamette Bird Alliance, and the Coast Range Association. The work you are all doing is increasingly important, so keep it up. I also want to give out a little shout out to Nissa, Parker, and Kent Doty of Seven Capes Bird Alliance. They've been instrumental in making this series possible. Thanks. Awesome. Just to let everyone know, this is a webinar format, so only the panelists will be visible and the audience is muted for the courtesy of the speaker. Following introductions, Dr. Betts will talk for about 50 minutes, and there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So please put your questions in the Q&A chat tab, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have some good conversation then. We should be finishing up about 7:30. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is going to be recorded. So yeah, just a little bit about who we are. Seven Capes Bird Alliance, formerly Lincoln City Audubon, has been serving Lincoln and Tillamook counties since 2006. Our core programs are education, community science, and conservation action. We provide monthly bird outings and events like our webinar series. And our conservation focus areas include forest practices, rocky habitats, marine reserves, water quality, and threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. Y'all can, if you're interested in learning more, you can check out our website. It's just sevencapes.org. And since this is the final webinar in this series, I wanted to just let everyone know we do have more coming down, hopefully in the spring and possibly the fall as well. So keep an eye out for that. Some more awesome webinars coming up. And before we get going, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement for the area and land we are living on here in Lincoln City. Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the disposition they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, the Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and act collectively as part of existing confederations. We encourage, as we engage with wildlife and the environment that surrounds us today, we pledge to learn from these nations within the Confederated Tribes of the Sletts, as well as our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and we look forward to collaborating on common goals with them. All right, and to now introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Matthew Betts is a professor and Ruth Spaniol Chair of Natural Resource Conservation in the Department of Forest and Ecosystems and the Society in College of Forestry at Oregon State University, where he has taught both undergraduate and graduates about forest biodiversity and management for 16 years. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. Dr. Betts completed his undergraduate degree and PhD in the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management at the University of New Brunswick and conducted his postdoctoral research at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, where he focused his research on population and molecular ecology. Dr. Bett's research focuses on plant and animal responses to forest management activities at local, regional, and global scales. He is the lead investigator for the Oregon Intensive Forest Management Project, lead scientist for the H.J. Andrews Long-Term Ecological Research Program, and the director and founder of the Oregon State University Forest Biodiversity Research Network. He is the author of over 140 peer-reviewed publications, including in the journals Science and Nature, Nature Ecology and Evolution, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And his work has been profiled in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, CBC, National Geographic, and Science America. His work is primarily funded by the National Institute for Food and Agriculture and the National Science Foundation. So please, everyone, help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Matthew Betts.
Thanks a lot, Heather. Thanks for the very long introduction. I've got to shorten that on my website if that's where you got that from, but yeah, thanks anyway. I'm going to try to make my presentation not that long. At least maybe it won't feel that long to me. Thanks everybody for coming to this virtual seminar. I wish it was in person so I could see your faces and get your reactions, but here we are. Today I want to talk to you about conserving forest birds, which has been the main part of my career for the last 25 years or so. And I'm going to take you to the tropics. I'm going to take you to the Coast Range of Oregon and the Cascades of Oregon to talk about some research we've been doing over the last 15 years or so. So anyone in the audience that knows me knows that I love forests. I've studied them, well, I've lived in them for many, many years. I grew up in Eastern Canada, playing in the forest and birding in the forest. And yeah, I've been in love with them for many, many years. They're also of critical importance to humanity. Obviously, about 1 billion of us depend on them directly for our livelihoods. The vast majority of terrestrial biodiversity lives in forests, including birds, of course. Most of our medicines have been derived from plants that occur in forests. And yeah, they're fantastic to visit. So that's the good news. The bad news is we've been losing forests, as maybe most of you know. This is some remote sensing that was done by University of Maryland group a number of years ago. Just for South America, the pink is showing you areas of forest loss over time. And this is just for a period between 2000 and 2015. So pink indicates forest loss for that area, greater than 75% of canopy loss. So in total, we're still losing about 1.5 million kilometers squared per year of forest. And this is probably no surprise to all of you either, that many of us are arguing that we're now in a 6th extinction period, 5 others being through more natural processes, but this one being caused by humans. And so rates of extinction are between 100 and 1,000 times historical rates. So a lot of my life these days has been focused on how do we handle this expanding human population and the resources we consume. Primarily, in my case, I'm interested in wood consumption. How do we balance that with biodiversity? Is there a way of handling that production and still have many species, all the species we love on the planet? So this is my question for you today. And actually, you're going to have to spend or pay particular attention, because at the end of this talk, I'm going to ask you a question that Kent has kindly set up as a survey. And so I'm going to talk to you with in 3 chapters. The first one is I'm going to take you to the tropics, some work we've done for over a decade on hummingbirds and pollination, probably appropriate for a snowy day here in Oregon. Next, I'm going to talk to you about some long-term research we've been doing on birds. and climate change in the Oregon Cascades. And then I'm going to talk to you about some work we've been doing that's much more applied on how intensive forest management affects birds and biodiversity more generally. And then last, it's your turn. I'm going to turn to you to see if you can answer some questions for me based on what you've learned today. Hopefully that sounds okay with everybody. Oh, and there's a bonus video at the end. I watched Dominic de la Sala's talk last week and saw that he had rather sneakily put a few videos in his talk. And so I am going to do the same thing with a longer video that showed up on OPB Field Guide if we have time. If not, I'll just give you the link and you can watch it on your own if you like. So more bad news. I'm sure many of you are quite aware that there's a pollinator crisis and a pollination crisis worldwide. These are some papers that came out a while ago highlighting those effects. And our lab group was really interested in trying to get to the bottom of why we're seeing these declines in pollination and what could be driving declines. This rufous hummingbird on the right, for example, has been declining quite rapidly across the Northwest. So, and of course, being a bird guy, I was particularly interested in the services that birds provide as pollinators. And in addition to that, hummingbirds are just incredible. 320 species across North and South America. A lot of people, when they look at this painting done by Ernst Haeckel in the 1800s, think it's fake. But I'm sure as birders, all of you know that that's not the case. They're all actually not even that crazy a representation of real species. The sword-billed hummingbird you can see in the middle there, horned sungem, red-tailed comet, booted racquet-tail, just have amazed naturalists for centuries. And long before that, of course, these hummingbirds have been iconic in native religions across the Americas. So why are hummingbirds cool? One, of course, are these colors. There's structural coloration. So in most cases, they're bending light with their feathers that result in these colors. They're incredible athletes. About a third of their body mass is pectoral muscle. They need to hover in flight. They're also incredibly intelligent. Their brains are larger in relation to their body mass than most birds. Incredible spatial memories and heartbeats of 1,200 beats per minute. Anyway, I could go on and on. I'll stop talking about the details of hummingbirds for a minute and get on to our research. Just to note that this is one of my favorite species, violet saberwing, which weighs a little bit more than a black-capped chickadee. And it's like a jet fighter pilot. And one of the reasons we decided to do work on hummingbirds as pollinators was because 15 years ago when we started the work, radio transmitters were too small, too large for bees. Bees were too small to hold transmitters. So we decided we wanted to try and put very, very, very small radio transmitters on hummingbirds to track their movements. I'll tell you why in a minute. So this is our study site in southern Costa Rica. The dark gray on the right is forest cover. And you can see that over time since 1947, when it's actually Italians first started settling the area, deforestation rates really spiked. Now, in the contemporary era, we're actually seeing restoration of forest across this landscape. But little area you can see in the middle there is our biological station, Las Cruces. And this whole landscape is where we've been doing work on hummingbirds and landscape fragmentation. So our overall question was, we wondered about what the causes are of pollinator decline and pollination decline. And one hypothesis was that it could well be that as we fragment landscapes worldwide, pollinators are having more trouble moving around landscapes. And so hummingbirds in this area were sufficiently large that we could track their movements to test this idea. And this was one of our focal plants, Helicornia tortuosa. And it's a really common understory plant throughout Costa Rica. It's one of many, about 300 species of Heliconia throughout the neotropics. And we've argued it's really a keystone plant. And that's because so many different species visit it, of hummingbirds, but also fruit eaters visit it regularly. About 30 species just in our study area alone, species like manakins. So we're interested in its reproduction and how its reproduction varied across this gradients and fragmentation. So the first thing we did was we went out and measured how often do these plants have fruit and how often do they have seeds within those fruit. And the answer was actually there's a lot of pollen limitation. These plants are not producing fruit and seeds like you might expect if there was sort of perfect pollination out there. And then my PhD student, Adam Hadley, who's now a scientist back in Canada, New Brunswick, um, looked at how patch size, so how fragmented patches were, affect the number of seeds that this keystone plant produced. And you can see here on the x-axis is the size of a patch, log transformed, and the y-axis is the number of seeds. And there's a really strong effect. So the bigger the patch, the more the seeds in these plants are getting pollinated better. And so one hypothesis we had then for this greater pollination and bigger patches was that hummingbirds are better able to move around through those patches, and there are more hummingbirds in those patches than in fragmented little patches. So this is where the telemetry came in. We got a chap that we knew quite well to try and develop a really tiny transmitter for us. So these are less than 5% of the bird body weight, about 0.25 of a gram. And we strategically used eyelash glue to attach these to the backs of birds with the idea that eyelash glue would wear out after a couple weeks when the battery died and the bird wouldn't be burdened with these transmitters. So we're a little bit, being the first people to put radio transmitters on, we were concerned about the health of the birds, and we started out really slowly with this. I could tell you anecdotes about this later on, but just to give you some idea, this is a female green hermit, and this is the nest that she has in a palm. And you can see the radio transmitter sticking out from her back here. And this is just representative of our overall experience. These birds moved around like jet engines, even with radio transmitters attached. And even we saw them winning interspecific competitions with still radio transmitters on. So what did we do once these birds had transmitters on them? We did another study entirely just looking at the move around the landscape on their own. But we also tried something that was more experimental. And this was to catch birds in their home location, move them across landscapes of different degrees of fragmentation, and then watch their paths on return. And this was only a small number of birds, 19 in total. And we transported about half of them across contiguous connected landscapes and the other half across quite fragmented landscapes. And this is what we found. I'm not going to show you many statistics today. So this map is just representative of 2 of the 19 birds. And if you look carefully, we've got these green squares, which is where we caught the birds. And then we moved them, in this case, about 1.5 kilometers away to where these blue triangles are. And then the yellow lines are the movement paths of these hummingbirds back. The orange, by the way, is pasture that's mostly used for cattle. And the green is mature rainforest. And you don't need stats to see that these birds were very faithful to moving through the forest. Even though they have incredible ability to move, they really avoided moving across gaps. And what this means then is that these little fragments you can see here, the little green patches, are much less likely to be visited by these birds, in particular green hermit hummingbirds. A little bit about the life history of these birds. They're what's called trapliners. So unlike rufous hummingbirds here in Oregon that defend territories very aggressively, these trapliners move long distances across landscapes. And so this trapliner would have been familiar, this green hermit would have been familiar with these landscapes in its daily movements. And a student of mine, Noelia Volpe, followed them just passively across landscapes and found they were moving 2 or 3 kilometers away from where we captured them. In a follow-up study, a postdoc of mine did something called a titration experiment. And this was to put feeders out through corridors on the top or just out into the open pasture on the bottom. And sure enough, he found that movement by birds to feeders was far, far greater through forested connections than through non-connections. And I will say there's a good news story to this. Over the 10 years we've been studying these species, the forest has been growing up in pastures. Demand for cattle is reduced in Costa Rica, And landowners actually get positive economic incentives to grow forest back. They get something called a payment for ecosystem services. And so as this landscape has been growing back, we've been seeing hummingbirds moving around the landscape much more easily. And some of those fragmented patches that I showed you that Adam had very little plant reproduction in are now showing much greater rates of seed set and fruit. So it's not all bad news, especially in Costa Rica. So I'm going to digress for just 1 minute away from my conservation-oriented talk here and talk about this really cool plant, Heliconia tortuosa. And I want to tell you this because often science seems like it's this polished thing that always works out perfectly and nothing ever goes wrong. And I want to advertise to you that for every one of these studies that we do, an immense amount of pain and difficulty can be behind the scenes. And so for this plant, we are curious in, as I said, it's reproduction. Here are the seeds. You can see in green, here are the fruits growing. They turn blue eventually when they ripen. These are the flowers, these yellow things. And we started the study with hand pollination to see if that could be the gold standard against which we compared hummingbird pollination across this fragmentation gradient. I hope you're still with me. So the key was we wanted to hand pollinate this plant as a gold standard baseline. And we figured that some of the birds that were the most co-evolve with these plants, with the most curved bills, would be the best pollinators. But we also figured that if we added pollen by ourselves, we should be able to mimic the pollen deposition of species like this awesome white-tipped sicklebill. By the way, this is actually one of the biggest species we capture in the neotropics at about 14 grams. And, you know, it turns out when we did really labor-intensive observations of which birds visited Heliconia tortuosa, the answer was quite a few visited. You know, so really, in theory, with all these different hummingbirds visiting it, it should be at low risk of having poor pollination. You know, it has lots of workers to fulfill the main thing it wants to do, which is to reproduce. And yet, when we went out and hand pollinated these plants, things didn't go quite as expected. So I'm just going to walk you through this figure. Open pollination on the left. This is what hummingbirds do. Hand pollination on the right, and people have been doing this for decades since Gregor Mendel, centuries, I should say. And we expect it to be way better than hummingbirds, okay? We're not using any fancy techniques. This is just taking pollen and putting it on the reproductive part, the receptive part called a stigma. Okay, and we call this pollen limitation, the difference between hand pollination and open pollination. This is what we actually saw. When we hand pollinated hundreds of these plants, turned out we were successful very, very few times, about 4 times. And hummingbirds, on the other hand, did a fantastic job of pollinating. So for whatever reason, these 2 Canadian ornithology/botany people you see on the right were poor at pollinating. And so we had 2 hypotheses for this. One is we were just bad at finding the right pollen quality. And the other was that the plant is somehow recognizing who's visiting it. And long story short, we tested the first one quite extensively and found very little support for it. I'm going to tell you about the second one right now. So to tease these 2 hypotheses apart, what we did was we put a bunch of heliconia inside an aviary we built. Okay, so no birds could visit these under normal circumstances. We then captured 6 species of hummingbirds and a butterfly, just for good measure, that we've seen visiting this plant. And we released them in the aviary one by one. And why do we do this? Well, we wanted to make sure we could separate out the effect of pollen quality that the hummingbirds would be carrying versus the pollen that we were collecting manually. I hope you're following. I can't see your faces. So this is the way of teasing apart the idea that it's pollen quality versus the plant is doing something to recognize the pollinator. Okay, so what we did then was we caught these birds, we cleaned them of all the pollen that they had on them. That's panel A here. And we did that with Fuchs and jelly, with brushes, and et cetera, till we have a very clean hummingbird. Then we released them into these aviaries that you can see in this picture, and we let them do their job. Meanwhile, we had already hand pollinated these plants. Okay, so they have pollen on them the way we did and failed, but instead now we have a hummingbird visiting after the fact that has no pollen on it. And so we do our regular analytical methods, which is we can tell whether a plant's been pollinated by looking at pollen tubes going down through the style. And that was our measure of whether or not pollination had been successful. So to cut to the chase here are our hummingbirds on the x-axis and one butterfly. Here are the pollen tubes, which are a measure of whether or not the plant's being actually fertilized. And to reveal, these two species here, violet sabrewing and green hermit, were recognized by the plants as being very useful pollinators, even though it was us that had delivered the pollen. These three species here, green crown brilliant, scaly-breasted and striped-throated hummingbird did okay, and then rufous tail and butterflies did terribly. And so if I was there in person, I'd be asking you to formulate hypotheses for what it is that's different between these different species. So the two species on the top are the ones that the plant is recognizing, and the two on the bottom are the ones the plant doesn't. If you look really carefully in the top right, you can see the green hermit hummingbird actually drinking nectar out of the flower. And the same for the violet sabrewing. And they're doing it very efficiently. Their bills are matching. And so we initially hypothesized that it was really, let's see if I can get this to start. It was the physical process of nectar extraction the plant is using to decide whether or not to turn on for these birds. And our initial results showed that we could experimentally pollinate them when we extracted nectar. But we've had a student follow up with this work more recently, and actually it's the mechanism is when the bird visits, it deposits a tiny bit of nectar. When birds are specialized enough to reach all the way into the nectary here, they bring up nectar and deposit it on the stigma, and that enables the plant to allow germination of pollen. So it's a really cool story because these two trap lining species with the curved bills are the ones that are most important to the plant. They're also the ones that are fragmentation sensitive, so they don't like to move across open areas. And so the combination of this plant being much pickier than you'd guess at from how many species of birds visit it, and the fact that its specialized pollinators can't cross gaps very well, answer the question of why this plant isn't succeeding in fragmented landscapes. All right, how do I? Oh no, hang on a sec. Okay, so with conclusions then, we found in this research that in contiguous landscapes on the left, we see a lot more hummingbird movement. I didn't show you this, but we also capture more hummingbirds in those big patches, the connected patches, and we also see more seeds and seedlings. So these landscapes are much better than for ecosystem functioning, particularly pollination, than landscapes that look like this on the right. And just, I don't want to drown you in data, but you can just listen to my voice instead of being lost in the figures. We found that the tendency, this is using a worldwide data set that we collected across 27 studies. The tendency for species to be more sensitive to fragmentation, in particular avoiding edge, is much greater in the tropics. So the x-axis in these figures is latitude, 0 being the equator. And the proportion of species that don't like edges, don't like fragmentation, don't like small patches is much, about 3 times bigger in tropical forests than in temperate forests like we have in Oregon. All right, I'm going to move on to the next chapter here. So now we're going much closer to home. In Oregon, we've been studying birds and microclimates for 15 years now. And as all of you know, climate change is having negative effects on biodiversity worldwide. I'm probably not going to be allowed to say that in a few weeks, but we'll see what happens. This is a paper that was published by a friend of mine a long time ago in 2004. And in this paper, he and authors projected that we should see 13 to 36% of species committed to extinction due to climate change. So not great news, but I will tell you that that study was based on something we call a climate envelope model. And what these models do is they build up distribution model for a species under the current climate, and then they project climate forward in time to what it will look like in the future. And then if the species range contracts, they argue that the species is going to decline and potentially be committed to extinction. So we tested these models using old breeding bird survey data that some of you might have collected. And so we built models back in 1983. We tested them in 2010, and we found that generally these models perform very badly. And maybe this doesn't surprise some of you, but it was a surprise sort of to the world of projecting the fate of biodiversity under climate change. So the question we've been asking at the H.J. Andrews and the Oregon Cascades are, why are these models so often wrong? And this is one hint. One hypothesis we had was that a lot of the climate data we collect are in these open stations. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that these open stations are collecting climate data that's very unlike what species are exposed to inside the forest. Obviously, if it's a really hot day, you go into the forest to try and get cooler. And so, especially species like this black-throated gray warbler that have the ability to move around and adjust where they are on a particular day based on microclimates. So if it's a really hot day, this bird can go into the shade, maybe even under a branch. If it's a cold day, it might go up to the canopy and bask in the sun. So we were asking the very basic question. In Oregon, we have quite a bit of the forest on the right, plantations, and less, but still some of old growth. And we want to know if the microclimate conditions in these different forest types is very different. And at this point, I'll ask you to take a guess at which you think is likely to be cooler during the breeding bird season. So to do this, a PhD student of mine, Sarah Fry, and me, and actually Adam Hadley from Costa Rica, instrumented the H.J. Andrews with microclimate loggers. In total, we had 184 sites, and all little black dots here you can see across about a 6,400 hectare watershed have these little hobo data loggers. And so that's a hobo logger on the left. It gets temperature every couple of minutes across the entire year. Millions and millions of temperature loggings. And so that combined with something we call LiDAR, which enables us to measure the forest structure in great detail. And we could distinguish old growth type forests from more simple structure plantations using LiDAR. And so this is the take-home message figure here. We have a forest structure gradient here going from plantations on the left of the x-axis to old growth on the right, and maximum monthly temperature during the breeding bird season on the y-axis. And you can see that overall, old growth tends to be cooler than plantation. And this might not seem like a lot. It's about 2.5 degrees Celsius cooler in old growth than plantations, but that's quite a bit. You know, that's not a worst case, but that'll be a bad scenario if our planet warms by 2.5 degrees over the next 30 years. And so these old growth forests really are providing this incredible service of keeping things cool. Of course, in relation to open areas, but even in relation to plantations, which are still quite closed canopy. So this is being used as a justification for another justification for conserving old growth forest. So this is a teaser for some work we haven't published, and I have a postdoc, Amelia Fitch, who's asking the question, are old growth forests warming more slowly than open stations? Okay, so maybe if we're lucky, old growth is actually not only just cooler, but it's actually warming over the long term more slowly. And here I make the pitch for the importance of long-term data. We're lucky in Oregon that we have about 18 climate stations that are not in the open. They're under forest, mostly under old growth. And so we could ask this question about the rate of warming. So there we go. You're the first people to see this result in the public. Forests are warming at about less than half the rate of these open air stations where you get your weather data and weather forecasts. So this is potentially a really good news and more justification for keeping forests around, and particularly old growth forest around. All right, I'm going to skip this slide because this is the OPB broadcast, but I'm just going to tell you about some of our findings about how birds respond to these gradients in microclimate. And this is Wilson's warbler, as probably most of you know. And in this test, we looked at breeding bird survey routes that had differing amounts of old growth and that had warmed at different rates. And the take-home message here is that even if a landscape has warmed a lot, if it's got old growth in it, population trends tend to be stable or positive. If a landscape has very little old growth in it, and it's warmed a lot, populations of this species tend to be declining quite rapidly. You can see on the y-axis here, like 4 to 6% per year. So this was a study done using citizen science data, found similar results, sorry, for hermit warbler and a few others. And if you watch the video, you'll learn that a PhD student of mine, Hong-Kyu Kim, did the same sort of test using really rigorously collected data at the Andrews and found similar effects. So long story short, cooler microclimates are better for bird populations, and things tend to be cooler in old growth. So it's all well and good for me to be on my high horse about the importance of old growth forest, but in 2023, starting in August, we had a huge fire at the Andrews. Some of our 500-year-old forest burned. The fire covered about 2/3 of the Andrews in total, destroying much of our instrumentation and burning through a lot of where we'd sampled birds over the years, our 184 sites. So it's we're expecting to see our microclimate to have shifted with quite high magnitude, and we haven't yet collected those data yet from the climate stations, but you can see how even though old growth has this capacity to buffer against the effects of climate change, if we have a fire that is at least partly due to climate change, that could well negate many of those effects. Okay, I hope you're all doing all right out there and my voice isn't too lulling you to sleep and you're still finding this somewhat interesting. This is the last chapter, and then it's going to be on you to be surveyed about how you would manage forests of the planet. So this last one, very different, the Oregon Cascades. This was in the Coast Range. And as many of you know, especially living on the coast, our Coast Range is heavily managed for timber, and it has been for quite a long time. So this is a controversial practice. These stands are clear-cut and often sprayed with herbicide, for example, Roundup, glyphosate, and a number of others. And the idea here is that they're sprayed to limit competition from non-Douglas fir trees and shrubs. So by killing off broadleaf plants and grasses, you can grow Douglas fir more quickly. But of course, these are chemicals, and they've been seen to have direct negative impacts on bees, for example. And many people have tried to have these chemicals removed because of potential human impacts. So our focus was much more on the wildlife side of things, and we're curious about how herbicide spray could influence plant diversity and then propagating through to bird abundance and diversity. So what's the difference between what you're seeing in the picture in A versus what you can see in the picture of B? And the background of this is when I first came to Oregon from New Hampshire, where I was doing my postdoc, I was curious about which species seemed to be declining at the greatest rates and what might be causing those declines. And much to my surprise, aside from the spotted owl, many of the species declining in Oregon were these species associated with early successional or young forest. This is just an example species, the orange-crowned, declining at over 4.5% per year, and Rufous hummingbird also declining at a similar rate. So what's causing these declines? And one hypothesis was that it had to do with intensive management. An alternative is, of course, that federal lands were getting older and older at the time, and maybe not so good habitat for these species. So to test these ideas, I was lucky enough to collaborate with a bunch of folks who were willing to manipulate these clear cuts with different amounts of herbicide. They were all clear cut in 2009. And then we had a range of herbicides from none in the control. Pay attention to these colors, by the way, because they're going to show up again. a light treatment, which is what you might find in Oregon Department of Forestry lands, a moderate on intensive on industrial lands, and then the intensive, which no one really does, and that's like 4 sprays. It's a very intensive treatment. So you can see these stands were very dynamic. This is just over the 4 years since, well, I guess six years since they were clear cut, but they're already growing back. You can see there are really big differences in the way they grow back. In the control, we've got big leaf maple coming up everywhere, lots of shrubs and grasses and ferns. In the intensive, it's mostly just the Douglas fir and growing quickly. So we set up this experiment not just once. You can see the 4 colors here representing the 4 treatments, but 8 times across the entire Coast Range, including over toward you, I guess, Siletz and Grand Ronde. And then we proceeded to measure biodiversity. So here are our 4 treatments again. We measured the direct effect of those herbicides on trees and shrubs and other plants, ferns and herbaceous species and grasses. And then we went well beyond birds and looked at moths, arthropods, ungulates with camera traps, pollinators with flower watches and dipnut sweeps, and of course birds. And in total, just a massive effort of sampling with 140,000 detections and about 835 taxa. All the arthropods weren't measured the species, but of course all the birds were. So here are some of our results. Starting in 2011, this is the common yellowthroat, many of you will be familiar with. The dotted line is the control, okay? And you can see the 3 other colors, blue, yellow, and red, are our treatments. And hopefully you can see that this is abundance in relation to the control. All of these treatments are about half the abundance of if you don't spray for the first 3 years of the study. With the intensive being the worst. See, these are confidence intervals around the dots. And then what happens is we see a gradual recovery in the treated sites to a point where they start matching the control for the species. Okay, it's like a hockey stick pattern. As a Canadian, I can say that. So this is a common pattern we see across species, especially those that rely on arthropods for their diet. McGilvery's warbler, initial depressed abundance in the treatments in relation to the control. Orange crown warbler, really in the intensive, not even recovering by 2017. Song sparrow, Swainson's thrush, Wilson's warbler, really in the more intensive treatments, never fully recovering. And so we now have a student who's restarting the study. We're obviously at 2025, and he's going to be seeing how things change this far out after the initial spraying. A take-home message is that leaf gleaning species, so birds that like to eat insects, are the worst responders to these. But then again, they do tend to recover about 6 years after the initial treatments. And just because we were impatient to wait 15 or 17 years, as another PhD student of mine went and he measured birds across an age gradient from these early seral stands through to when they start closing canopy. And the idea was maybe these stands become good habitat after about 7 or 8 years, but as they close canopy and things get really shady, perhaps that's not so good for these early successional species. And I should say the intensively managed stands tend to close canopy more quickly. This is just an example, sorry about the blurry figure, but what Scott found was that these birds peak in abundance around year 10 and then start declining as the canopy closes. Okay, so intensive management, although it doesn't mean non-habitat for species, what it does is it shortens the window of time that habitat's available, both at the front and the back end, we think. So this is the case for a number of species that Scott counted over time, show these hump-shaped relationships in the middle of this early seral period. Gosh, I hope I'm not getting too sciencey, but I know a bunch of you are interested in this stuff, so I'll keep going. So this is the final chapter, by the way, you're almost through. One of the things we're interested in was how timber yield, or how many board feet you can harvest from these lands, might trade off against the richness of all these different species, including birds. And generally, the take-home message was that we do see trade-offs. We were a little surprised that this is just for woody plants, by the way. We're a little surprised the trade-offs weren't stronger. You know, the more wood you produce, the more you spray, the more wood you produce, and the fewer species you have. But the trade-offs that exist for many of these taxonomic groups, including birds, but especially in the early seral period. By the late seral period, we didn't see any significant differences. All right, so in total, we see trade-offs for 5 taxonomic groups, and for 3, they're more neutral relationships. Okay, so I'm winding things up here. What I've told you today then is that conservation of intact forests is important, but particularly in the tropics. Many more species are sensitive to fragmentation and loss of rainforest in the tropics, even in the temperate zone. I've told you that old growth in Oregon is extremely important for buffering climate-sensitive bird species against the effects of global warming. And I've just finished telling you about how, we don't see intensively managed stands non-habitat, but they're reduced habitat as a result of intensive management. And the more wood we grow, typically the worse habitat it is for some of these early seral species. So given this, we're seeing really a linear increase in wood consumption with human population growth. Excuse me. This seems like a deterministic sort of relationship where the more humans we have on the planet, the more wood we consume. How do we get our wood? What is the solution here? If you were an omnipotent dictator of the planet, how would you decide to feed this demand? Okay, so how should we get our wood? And I'm going to give you 4 options. And this is very real. Do we eliminate spray? Do we ban spray in Oregon and maybe across the temperate zone? And save old growth, but get most wood from the rainforest. So this is what we call exporting the consequences of our consumption. In the West, we like to have large houses and use quite a lot of paper. We're going to get that from Brazil and Ecuador and places that I've just described to you, like Costa Rica. Option 2 is to spray. So we're growing our wood intensively, but on a small area. And that enables us to save the old growth forest from everything except fire, and also to save the rainforest. So we're no longer exporting the consequences of our consumptive habits. Or 3, we eliminate spraying. So we now need a bigger area to supply the wood demand, which results in us cutting old growth, but we save the rainforest, the highly biodiverse rainforest. And the last option I'm going to give you is eliminate spray, save old growth, save the rainforest, and reduce our rates of consumption. So Kent has been kind enough to set up a survey. Kent, are you there still?
Here, I'm
And how
here,
do you
and
launch the
I'll
survey?
apologize to the audience ahead of time. This is the first time I've done a survey and it's on the fly, so we'll see if this works. But you're going to choose one of these 4, and hopefully you'll have when I hit save, you'll have that chance to try that.
And I will say that I sprung this on Kent about 5 minutes before I was due to get on Zoom. So if this doesn't go smoothly, it's definitely my fault. I'm not seeing the survey, Kent, but
Should be coming now.
oh, there it is. Okay.
I'll see if I can't quite hide it.
I'm not allowed to vote, which is fair enough.
Matt, I'll let you choose when to end the
Okay.
poll.
Well, I think we should call it now. And I'm running out of time a bit, but when do we get to see the results?
Can you see the untitled, the bar on the should show choice one. There was 4% of the people chose choice one out of
Okay.
27. Choice two, we had 3 out of 28. Choice three, nobody chose choice three. And number 4 was very popular, 25 out
Okay.
of 28 people.
Yeah, and I will say I'm not a social scientist, so I'm a terrible survey designer, but I would expect that to be the case. And very interesting, those of you that chose the other options. And the reality we face as humans is that we're not doing choice four. We're not very good at, and I think it's partly an issue of what difference does one individual make? But I would love to see choice four more common. I would give us a lot more options, but so far the data aren't supporting that, as you can see in let's see, in this figure, right? So anyway, that's my attempt at a take-home message for the talk, and I do want to thank all of the funders that have funded our research over the many years, and thanks to all of you for attending. And of course, really, I'm just a representative of this lab group I've been lucky enough to work with over the many years, PhD students and postdocs and master's students. So with that, I'll stop, and happy to answer any questions. I think we'll skip, what I'll do, Kent, is give you the link to the OPB episode that features our Andrew's work, and people can watch it on their own time.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much. I believe Nissa is going to facilitate our Q&A section.
Yes, we've got a few questions in the Q&A. This one is kind of procedural, I suppose. One person is wondering about the ultimate publication of the research that you showed from one of your, is a student or I believe a student who did the studies showing the rates of warming between forests and open canopy areas. When can we expect to see that, and will it be able to be shared with people who might be interested?
Yeah, I hope so. We hope we'll have the paper finished within a couple months and then submitted. And as probably a lot of you know, it's a long peer review process. It can be 3 months to 8 months, but hopefully the paper will be, widely distributed by definitely this time next year, but ideally by fall.
Awesome. So keep your eye out. You didn't speak to this specifically in your talk, but I think we have plenty of time to answer questions, so I'll go ahead and field it to you. Of the 4 alternatives in the Northwest Forest Plan amendment process, which provides the greatest protection for old growth forests?
That's a good question. And I wish I had a colleague of mine here, Meg Krawczak, to answer that rather than me. But I must admit, I'm still in the process of reviewing the amendment, and I'm going to be providing comments. I know some of the controversy has been around what do we do to protect old growth in a new era of increased fire. And so this was one of the really controversial aspects. Do we deliberately try and protect it with fire suppression? Do we try and protect it with silviculture surrounding our remaining old growth? But so that's one of the key questions. Do you do active management in order to save the old growth forest we have? And some would argue that we should actually manage in old growth to try and make it more climate and fire resilient. So it's a complex question, and I don't really want to take a stab at it beyond what I've just said without having gone through the amendment in great detail.
Very fair. The next question, I'll do this in 2 parts. It's the same person who submitted 2, and they're related, I think. What can the average person do to help? And part 2, what other building materials can we use, and why are they not used more?
Yeah, and this is that, the problem is these global sorts of questions are just very difficult. At the moment, concrete is an alternative to wood, of course, right? A lot of people use concrete, and it's not bad in terms of fire resistance, but it's terrible from a climate perspective. So the energy it takes to make concrete and the off-gassing concrete does is quite bad for global warming. So wood is a good option. It's just the problem is, you won't believe this, but a study that I read a while ago showed that the half-life of a house in North America is about 50 years. So I would argue that one thing we can do to help is to, you can still use wood, but use it in a way that could last for a long, long time. Our houses should be lasting for centuries, not decades. And I wish we could spend more time thinking about the quality of things than the rapid consumption of things. So other building materials, sure. I mean, there are some people that are using bamboo, and you often see, for example, bamboo advertised as this kind of forest-friendly product, but it's not forest-friendly if you're cutting down forest and replacing it with monoculture bamboo. Yeah. So it's quite complicated, but I would say, as I hinted in my presentation, reduction is the key, and then longevity is the other key. I love wood myself, wooden instruments, and I make tables, but they're things that should last a long time.
Great. We have some discussion about the survey, which I think I'm going to skip over for right now because we've gotten some questions that are more directly related to your talk.
The anonymous attendees, I do want to point this out, that number 4 is an impractical solution. I do think we can reduce reliance on wood by having products that last longer. That would be my solution to that. And we don't, I think average median home size in the US has increased from something like 1,700 square feet to 2,700 square feet. Do we need to live in these giant places? And of course, most of us don't, but many people do. So reduction, I would say, is the solution. It is possible. We just need the will.
I'm gonna skip down to Joe's question. Amendment to the Northwest Forest Plan emphasizes increasing early sterile forests on the landscape to benefit species dependent on this stage. Are those species at risk? Do we really have a significant need to increase early sterile forests?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, looking at those long-term breeding bird survey declines, as species like orange crown warbler and Rufous hummingbird, I would have said, yeah, we're short of early sterile, especially complex. Those plantations I'm showing you pictures of are designed to grow timber, but back then, at least, we didn't have much naturally regenerating early sterile forest with high diversity. Everyone knows who's visited them. They're great places to go birding. A complex early sterile forest that may be burned 15 years ago is packed full of birds. And so, yeah, that long ago, I would have said, yeah, we've got a problem. But since we've had so many fires since 2016, I'm starting to walk that back. We're producing a lot of it, and it can be produced very quickly with a fire. Whereas the old forests are hard to grow, and they take a long time to grow. And sure, there are silvicultural methods you can use to try and make big trees faster, like thinning and variable retention harvests, but it's still just a slow process. So I would lean, if it were me involved with the amendment, I would definitely be still leaning toward trying to conserve old forests and do forestry that maintains old forest characteristics.
Tree planting is very popular, but it has trade-offs related to diverse early sterile ecosystems. Can you offer insights?
Yeah, well, that's what our research was designed to do, and so the question is whether you want to try to grow wood on a smaller land base, using softer approaches like reduced herbicides, and maybe some more retention of older trees, or whether you want to, yeah, if you don't use intensive approaches, you're going to spread out the impact beyond to get the same wood supply. So to reduce trade-offs, I would say the key thing you do would be to manage more gently, not have herbicides, have some retention, but the trade-off is that you produce less timber. So yeah, I mean, one short-term thing people could do would be to grow trees at lower densities. And that enables these plants that compete with Douglas fir to survive longer and provide habitat for birds for a longer period of time.
Great. Let's see. Are we seeing a difference in levels of rain and precipitation in old growth versus closed canopy forests, or is there only a difference in temperature?
Yeah, we have looked at that actually, and we're not seeing big differences at a local scale at the Andrews in precipitation. That's very different if you went somewhere like the Amazon, where these rainforests really are generating their own weather. And we're seeing a tipping point in that. But typically under normal conditions, old primary forest is creating more rain, and more denuded younger forests are doing less of that.
This is a good question. How do we get agency scientists to follow the science? It's as though they live on a different planet and continue to wreak havoc despite the evidence clearly demonstrating the status quo is responsible for climate change and biodiversity loss. So,
Yeah. Well, we try to work a lot with managers to bring them in on the science with us and feel some ownership over it as well. And the issue is, the nuance in this question is that it's not the agency scientists who are making the management decisions. The agency scientists often work in different buildings to people who are doing the management, and the managers don't necessarily have to listen to the agency scientists. So that's the trick. How do we get the management to follow the science? And if you find the answer to that, let me know. It's, out of all the years I've been doing this work, I don't know how many papers I've published in total. You can look it up, but I probably only had 4 or 5 that have a direct connection to change in management on the ground, which is a bit sad when you think about it. But it's I really value those studies, and I wish I had a secret to how to guarantee science's implementation. But sadly, and I don't want to leave on a sad note, but if anything, we're seeing less trust in science from the general public and from managers than we did even a decade ago. And so I think a really important question to ask, if anyone here is at the big front end of their career, how do we encourage society as a whole to go back to trusting science and scientists more? And I would say some of that is to have citizens actually collecting scientific data, understanding how it's collected, learning it's not just done by some weirdo in a lab coat, but it's just a neat way of thinking. So anyway, long answer to a short question, but yeah, we need society to understand how science works. And I think it's going to take quite a big lift to do that.
Great answer. Still getting a lot of questions flowing in, so we'll try to get through them. But you spoke earlier you spoke of early success. I always struggle with this word, successional species. How about late successional species?
Yeah, right. That's a great question. And a paper I can post in the chat if I can find it. We looked at both, and we looked at their long-term trends over time across the whole Northwest. And actually, late successional species, despite the Northwest Forest Plan, that has mostly resulted in, forests getting older on average on federal lands, we're still seeing declines in late successional species. So I would say they've got to be a focus. They do. And we haven't solved the problem with the Northwest Forest Plan from 30 years ago. Yeah, I'll look for that paper while you ask the next question, Nessa.
And just so you know, I'll be emailing everybody when the recording of this webinar is available. So if there's anything that you want to share with people, links or videos or otherwise, you can either send those to me or one of my colleagues, and we'll get this out to everybody.
Yeah, I think there's no way of me putting
Yeah,
it
you
in the
don't
chat
have
for everyone.
to chat.
Yeah. I put it in for you, Nessa, but if you can get it out to everybody, that'd be great.
Will do. All right. So awesome. Here's some questions from Paul Engelmeyer. With forest fragmentation being a significant issue in the Coast Range bioregion, average interior forest patch size of approximately 200 acres and industrial clear cutting and national forest thinning appears to impact other interior species. Can you discuss connectivity and canopy closure recommendations in order to create large blocks of habitat? Benefits would be for more than just increasing survivorship of the chicks, but carbon storage as well as canopy connectivity for the marten and microclimate issues.
Wow, thanks, Paul. I'm going to answer the question before it and this at the same time. See if I can do this. Liz asked what kind of outreach we do for state and federal agencies, and the answer to Paul's question relates to that. I just gave a presentation at the Oregon Board of Forestry, I guess 3 weeks ago, and was asked the question that Paul just asked about what would I do differently in Oregon, or what initial changes could be made to policy. And it is weird, a lot of people don't realize this policy exists, but there's a maximum clear-cut size, 120 acres. And also we don't allow cuts to happen beside each other. There's something called a green up delay. You can't cut beside something that's already been cut until that turns green. Rough way of describing it. But and what this has done is it's resulted in incredible fragmentation of the Coast Range. Right, if you can only have a cut of such size and you can't have two beside each other, it spreads the impact over across a huge area. And so one proposal would be to actually try and mimic the spatial pattern of natural disturbance in the Coast Range more effectively, which would have been bigger areas. They wouldn't have looked like clear cuts from a fire, obviously. Fires don't remove all of the timber, but I think some changes could be made so that we maintain larger blocks of contiguous connected forest. And if the idea is to still maintain some cutting, you would, and this is an unpopular opinion, I know, but you would have more concentrated, potentially, they'd still be heterogeneous, but larger cuts that are connected as well. So that's my answer, Paul. It's again, if the answer was let's just stop cutting in the Coast Range altogether, what would happen would be, I would predict that what happened during the Northwest Forest Plant era, which was wood consumption doesn't go down. And in fact, it went to my home country of Canada. Wood production in British Columbia, harvesting at old growth, went through the roof with the Northwest Forest Plan. And by the way, a lot of the rest of it came from the Amazon. So I do think it's so smart, or it's so important to be smart about how we make these decisions and not exporting the consequences of the conservation we all want to see here to somewhere else on the planet. I hope you all take that as a take-home message.
So Paul has a second question. The Pacific Seabird Group has recently completed restoration recommendations concerning no-cut buffers adjacent to occupied stands. Can you speak about that issue?
Yeah, right. And this is very much in process. Paul, as you know, we've been collecting data on active marbled murrelet nests in the Coast Range now, and a very expensive project funded by the Oregon legislature. And so we have a grad student who after all that effort, we found 29 nests in a very unbiased way. Wish I presented on this actually, but and we are finding edge effects on those nests. They're not super strong, but it seems like the closer to an edge you are, the greater the chance of that nest not surviving. We also know from a much bigger data set that a site is less likely to be occupied by murrelets in the following year if it's on an edge. And Paul, you've probably seen the papers that show that. So I would say, and I'm being a real scientist here, but the jury is out still, but it looks like, in Oregon, in the Coast Range, we see some negative effects of edge on marbled murrelets. And that would have implications for your question, I think. Should we have no-cut buffers adjacent? One thing we don't know much about is the extent to which doing some kinds of thinning adjacent to occupied stands has a negative effect. And that's something we're hoping to get at with some bioacoustics work. And I'm gonna put another paper that addresses Paul's question in the chat for you. So.
Great.
Yeah, and go feel free to ask. I can multitask here.
Okay. Great. Let's see. Can longer rotations produce more timber?
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. That's another one. I think who brought that up?
Darlene Sherman.
Darlene, that's a really good question. This argument that intensive management necessarily produces more timber is not correct unless you grow trees at least to the age at which they stop accumulating wood as quickly. Okay, so at the moment, for example, we're cutting trees in the Coast Range, typically by we, I mean, companies at about 35 to 45 years. And Douglas fir don't even reach the peak of their growth until between 60 and 80. So one way of actually getting more wood, this is a critical point, I'm really glad you brought it up, is by simply letting trees live longer before they're cut. Okay, and of course for carbon storage, leaving them as long as possible is good. But even if you wanted to maximize wood supply, they should be cut later than we're cutting them. And this would be a great change in legislation, I would say. And my lab group's doing an analysis with global data asking if we did that worldwide, if we just let trees grow to the age at which they achieve maximum growth rate, how much carbon would we store? How much more wood would we have? How much less area would we need to cut? I expect the answer is going to be quite dramatic.
That's great. Right. Heather, just interrupt me if we are running out of time.
We're looking okay right now.
Okay. Oh, Darlene says that she is an ecologist. So.
Oh, you're cheating. Okay, that's good. That's a great question, though. Thanks, Darlene.
All right. Do you have any concerns re Trump's remarks to weaponize the God Squad, given how the northern spotted owl was treated?
Oh my gosh, I don't really know what that means.
I
What is the God Squad? Can somebody?
if anyone knows, put it in the Q&A. We'll move on for now.
Yeah, I have concerns right now about NSF being frozen. That's what concern that I have. But let's try not to get into that right now.
Sounds good. Let's stay on the focus. We got into this a little bit earlier, but another person after that conversation asked, how may we get the public to urge policymakers to support science?
Yes. Yeah. Well, a scientifically literate public that does demand science from the representatives. I'm a new American. I just became a citizen, by the way, about 6 months ago. And it's just so important to participate in the democracy you're part of. I think we're seeing some of the consequences of not doing that now. But yeah, it's sort of cool. The reason we ended up doing our marble murrelet research was because the public in Oregon, including bird groups across the state, but also even industrial groups, were demanding of the legislature that we have some reliable science on marble murrelets. And as a result, the state spent money on that project. And some days I wish they hadn't because it was such a massive amount of work. But that's the sort of thing that we can get if people just pipe up and say science matters. And yeah, I think science has some work to do as well in terms of increasing its reliability. Maybe some of the loss of public trust in science was that people started paying attention to preprints that weren't peer reviewed yet during the pandemic. That's one hypothesis. All these news, if you remember all these news items coming out about the latest treatment or how it was spreading or what you would do to get it. And none of those were peer-reviewed papers. And I think it detracted from science's credibility. So we've got to do more on the science side too, to make it clear what's reliable, what's not reliable science, and try and call out the unreliable stuff. I mean, where there's a move, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not droning on, but there's a move to making data accessible, all the code that goes into our statistics accessible, and making the whole process much more transparent, which I think is a really important move that will hopefully enhance public trust.
That's a good answer. We might have time for at least one more, if not a couple, but getting to the end of our time for questions. So happy to forward the ones that we don't get to you afterwards. Are we seeing any bird species that thrive on the edge affect increasing in population?
We haven't done that analysis per se, identified edge associates, then testing to see if they're increasing, except for some corvid species. And there we are. So species that all of you are probably familiar with, Steller's jay. We're seeing, especially, this is interesting, in places that are warming and edgy, the species seems to be on the increase. So Canada jay, I think we didn't see that same effect. It was mainly Steller's. That doesn't bode well for species like murrelets that have Steller's jays as nest predators.
See.
Oh boy, killing barred owls. Let's not talk about that for now.
Sounds good. I'm gonna go to the
There's no win with that whole situation, I would say.
It probably might be last one, depends. So if late successional species have not recovered the way we wanted under the Northwest Forest Plan, is the answer to focus more on habitat protection for a reason, or a reason to abandon habitat protection and focus on fire prevention?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, there's kind of two sides of the same coin, but the problem is, this is especially on the east side, there is fuel buildup. I've thought a lot about this over the years. It's quite controversial even in scientific circles, but I would say that the people are leaning toward, we actually do need to do some active management in east side forests to reduce the likelihood of fire and thereby increase habitat. And part of the problem, as many of you know, is that we've removed fire from the system for so long with our fire prevention activities, putting fires out and removing indigenous people from these landscapes. So, and this is very rough-hewn answer, but I would say some of the answer has to do with adding fire back into the system in ways that aren't massive conflagrations, but very strategic use of fire that mimics more the historical range of variation. And that could well do some interesting things for bird habitat, like creating a heterogeneous landscape that both late seral and early seral species occur in. So I would say it's not a abandon habitat protection or focus on fire prevention. I would say we need to introduce some fire into the system to actually protect habitat and generate habitat for species. But that's a general answer. The details are much more tricky. Thanks, Joseph.
I think about 2 more minutes. So there's some discussion about the God Squad, but I'll send those to you because it's
okay. Yeah, I'll Google it.
Another question from Paul: can you speak to the value of fog drip?
A fog drip. I'm looking for it. Yeah, value in terms of microclimate, or maybe Paul and I can talk about that one at some other point.
Okay.
Okay, I'm seeing a link to the God Squad. Okay, boy, this is gonna make my night, isn't it?
It's gonna make it or break it.
Yeah.
All right, well,
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, Nissa, thanks very much for asking all those questions. That was a lot.
Thank you so much for
Um,
answering.
And
the-
Heather and Kent, thanks for inviting me. And thanks to everybody for listening. Much appreciated. Amazed you've hung on this long. Congratulations. And yeah, if anyone has any more questions, email is somewhat reliable way of getting in touch with me. But definitely you could call my office number or send questions to Nissa and then she'll pass them on to me.
Well, thank you so much. I'm actually really looking forward to reading about your PhD students' work on the old growth forest and how much they're or the rate at which they're warming versus non. That sounds really interesting. So
Oh, thank you. Good. Yeah.
yeah,
Great,
awesome.
Heather. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much,
Thanks
Matt.
everyone for
It's great.
coming.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.